Welcome back to One Boring Historian. Before we start, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it? Are you here late at night with the lights low, or sneaking in a little history before your day begins? Drop your location and time in the comments. I always like seeing how far this quiet little classroom reaches. Now, imagine this. The city is ancient. The walls are made of clay. Outside, markets are closing, and in a narrow street that smells of incense and smoke, an exchange takes place, older than money, older than temples, older even than written law. This story isn't about scandal. It's about survival. It's about what happens when human need meets human judgment, and how every civilization, no matter how advanced or devout, found a way to both depend on and despise the same profession. Tonight, we're tracing the oldest thread in recorded history. From sacred rituals in Mesopotamia to the shadowed streets of Victorian London. This is how society built, banned, and bargained with the oldest profession. If you enjoy long, quiet explorations through the forgotten corners of human history, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and join others who prefer their stories slow, detailed, and boringly accurate. Now, let's begin. The dawn of civilization is not a single moment, but a slow, creeping light across the floodplains of great rivers. It begins in the Fertile Crescent, a land cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates, where the silt was rich and black, and the first cities clawed their way up from the mud. Here, in the heat and the dust, amidst the smell of baking bread and drying fish, the first bricks were laid, the first words were written, and the first laws were codified. And here, in the shadow of ziggurats that scraped a hazy, copper sky, the most ancient evidence of our story emerges, a story not of sin, but of survival, not of vice, but of the sacred, a story woven into the very fabric of society, religion, and economy. This is the origin of what would, millennia later, be called the oldest profession. To understand it, one must first shed the weight of later morality. For the early urbanites of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the world was a place of immense capricious power. The rivers could give life with their annual floods, or take it away in a devastating deluge. The sun could nurture the barley or scorch it to dust. The wind could bring the coolness of the evening or the hot, gritty breath of a dust storm. In this world, the forces of nature were not abstract concepts. They were gods, living, breathing entities of immense passion and will. And the most potent, the most vital force of all, was the power of creation itself, sexuality, fertility, the raw, generative energy that ensured the crops would grow, the livestock would multiply, and the people would prosper. This energy was personified in the great goddess, known to the Sumerians as Inanna, and to the later Babylonians as Ishtar. She was not a gentle maiden of the harvest. She was a complex, formidable, and often terrifying deity. She was the queen of heaven, the goddess of love and war, of sexual desire and political power. Her laughter could topple kings, her rage could decimate armies, but most importantly, she was the source of the generative force that animated the world. The act of sex was her sacred domain, a microcosm of the cosmic union between the goddess and her consort, Damuzi. A union upon which the fertility of the entire land was believed to depend. It was within this theological framework that the first temple priestesses, the Nugig and the Nadichu, emerged. These were not women on the margins of society. They were elite, often literate, and held significant economic and religious status. Their primary function was to serve the goddess, and a central aspect of that service involved sacred sexuality. In the temple precincts, in rooms fragrant with the smoke of cedar and myrrh, These priestesses would engage in ritual intercourse with priests, or sometimes with the king, acting as the earthly embodiment of Inanna. This was not prostitution in the modern, transactional sense. It was a hyos gamos, a sacred marriage. The act was a powerful piece of sympathetic magic, a divine duty performed to ensure that the cosmic energies of creation continued to flow, that the land would remain fertile, and the city would be blessed. The air in the city of York, perhaps the largest city in the world at the time, would have been thick and complex. The smell of animal sacrifice from the temple altars mixed with the odor of humanity crowded into mud brick houses. The tang of the river, the sweetness of date wine, and the pervasive fine dust that settled on everything. The streets were narrow, winding canals of shadow and light, bustling with potters, metal workers, and merchants haggling over bolts of wool and bags of grain. And within this vibrant, chaotic tapestry, the temple of Inanna was the beating heart, both spiritually and economically. It was not just a place of worship. It was a vast administrative complex, a storehouse for grain, a center for redistributing goods, and a home to its dedicated staff. Alongside the high-status priestesses, there existed other women whose service to the goddess took a different, more public form. These were the harimtu. Their role is less clearly defined in the cuneiform tablets that have survived the centuries, but they appear to have been women who were independent of the traditional patriarchal household, neither daughters, wives, nor widows under a male guardian. They operated in the secular sphere, often in the taverns and marketplaces that clustered round the temple walls. The harimtu engaged in sexual relations as a form of trade, and their earnings often went, in part, as tribute to the temple itself. They were, in a sense, the free agents of the goddess's domain, their economic activities still shadowed by her spiritual authority. A man visiting a harimtu was not merely satisfying a physical urge. He was participating, however distantly, in the generative power that Inanna governed. The transaction was both commercial and symbolic, exchange of silver for a taste of the sacred life force. This intertwining of the sacred and the transactional is starkly evident in the world as first known written legal code, the Code of Hammurabi, king of Babylon, carved into a towering black diorite stele round 1750 for BC. Hammurabi's laws did not seek to eradicate prostitution. They sought to regulate it, to define its place within the rigid hierarchy of Babylonian life. The code meticulously distinguishes between different classes of women and their rights. A married widow, or free woman, was subject to strict laws of fidelity, but the harimtu and the kadishtu, another class of temple woman, are mentioned matter-of-factly, their rights to property and the consequences for harming them clearly laid out. For instance, the laws dictate that a dowry given to an Adichu priestess who never bore children would be inherited by her brothers, but her own personal property, acquired through her service, was hers to bequeath as she wished. This was a remarkable degree of financial independence for a woman in the ancient world. The code also addresses the paternity of children born to these women, outlining inheritance rights in a way that acknowledges the reality of their lives without blanket condemnation. The primary concern of the law was not the morality of the act, but the preservation of property rights and the clear delineation of social status. A man's primary wife was the vessel for his legitimate heirs. The harimtu and priestesses existed in a separate, legally recognized category, integral to the economic and spiritual ecosystem, but kept carefully outside the patrilineal family structure. To walk through the crowded quays of Babylon was to witness this ecosystem in full. Noisy operation, the river would be choked with barges carrying timber from the north, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and copper from Cyprus, merchants, after months on dangerous trade routes, would disembark with wealth in their purses and a deep-seated need for a connection, for release, for a ritual cleansing of the journey's grime. They would find their way to the taverns, which were often run by women and were centers of both commerce and carnal pleasure. Here, in the dim light, through the haze of beer and smoke, the Hrinta would ply their trade. The exchange of silver was a clinical, economic reality, but the context was still steeped in the aura of Ishtar. This was her city. The desire that drew the merchant was her domain. The act itself was a thread in the vast, tangled web of urban life that connected the temple to the tavern, the king to the commoner. The sacred dimension, however, should not be overly romanticized. For the women involved, the reality was undoubtedly complex. While a high priestess of Inanna held immense prestige, the life of Hrinta was likely one of hardship and vulnerability. The legal protections offered by Hammurabi's code were real, but they existed within a system that ultimately viewed women as dependents of men. The independence of the Hrinta came at a cost. She existed outside the protective sphere of a father or husband, exposed to the whims of clients and the fluctuations of the economy. Yet, for some, it may have been a preferable alternative to a life of domestic servitude or a marriage arranged. For economic or political gain, it was a path, however precarious, to a measure of autonomy in a world that offered women few such pots. This earliest phase of our history presents a profound paradox to the modern mind. Sex work was not yet a profession segregated into a shadowy underworld. It was, instead, a multifaceted institution, its practitioners ranging from the highest echelons of the religious order to independent businesswomen in the bustling market. Its meaning was equally layered. It was a sacred duty to channel divine fertility, a commercial transaction in a growing monetary economy, and a social safety valve in densely populated urban centers. The act itself carried a weight of symbolism, connecting the human body to the cycles of the natural world and the favor of the gods. The slow, turning centuries would see this complex tapestry begin to unravel, as empires rose and fell as the Assyrians forged their brutal, militaristic state. And as new religious and philosophical currents began to flow from the west, the sacred would gradually be prized apart from the transactional. The goddess would be demoted, her priestesses stripped of their power, and the act that was once a conduit for divine energy would be recategorized, in some quarters, as a source of pollution and shame. But in these first cities, under the watchful eyes of Inanna and Ishtar, the generative power of sex was as essential, as undeniable, and as fundamental as the rising of the sun and the flooding of the rivers. It was the lifeblood of the world, and those who mediated its power, in both temple and tavern, held a place that was, for a time, central, sanctioned, and starkly necessary. The story begins not with a whisper of condemnation, but with the resonant, echoing chant of hymn to the Queen of Heaven, a celebration of the raw, untamable force that made the world green and the people numerous. It begins not with sin, but with survival, and with the sacred. The great rivers of Mesopotamia continued their slow, meandering flow to the sea, and as their waters mingled with the tides of the Mediterranean, a new cultural current began to form. To the west, along the fertile ribbon of the Nile, and to the north, along the rocky coasts of Canaan and Phoenicia, civilizations rose that would take the ancient intertwining of sex and the divine and stretch it, twist it, into a new and enduring tension. Here, in the shadow of pyramids and within the crowded port cities of the sea peoples, the simple, generative power witnessed in the temples of Inanna began to fracture. A duality emerged, not yet a schism between good and evil, but a deepening separation between the sublime and the mundane, the state-sanctioned sacred and the freewheeling profane. The world was growing more complex, and with that complexity came a new, ambiguous space for the women who mediated desire. In the land of Egypt, the Nile was not a capricious god, but reliable. Rhythmic heartbeat, its annual inundation was predictable, a divine gift that deposited rich, black silt onto the fields with clockwork precision. This sense of cosmic order, of mat, permeated every aspect of life, from the pharaoh's divine rule to the farmer's daily labor. Egyptian religion, consequently, lacked the terrifying, chaotic passion of Ishtar. Their gods were more remote, their rituals more formalized, their cosmology a grand, balanced machine, and yet the generative force of sexuality was still deeply woven into their understanding of creation. The most potent expression of this was the cult of Hathor. She was the goddess of love, beauty, music, dance, and drunkenness, a celestial patron of all that brought joy and ensured the continuation of life. Her temples were not places of quiet contemplation, but centers of vibrant, ecstatic celebration. Troops of women, known as the Kina, were dedicated to her service. They were musicians, dancers, and priestesses whose performances, often involving the rhythmic clatter of sistrums and the sinuous, hypnotic movement of their bodies, were intended to channel the goddess's joyful, life-giving power. These rituals were a form of divine service, a means of pleasing the goddess and, by extension, maintaining the fertility of the land and the people. The air in the temple of Hathor at Dendera would have been thick with the scent of Kythia complex, incense of honey, wine, raisins, and resins, and alive with the sound of flutes and tambourines. During great festivals, the statue of the goddess would be carried from the temple's dark, cool sanctum out into the blinding sunlight, and the Kina would lead the processions. Their movements a public invocation of Hathor's blessings. It is within this context that the concept of the sacred courtesan begins to crystallize, while the evidence is less explicit than in Mesopotamia. It suggests that some of these women, perhaps the highest ranked among them, engaged in ritualized sexual acts as part of their devotion. To be with such a woman was not a sordid transaction. It was a form of communion with Hathor herself, a participation in the divine joy that sustained the universe. Yet, outside the temple walls, in the bustling, sun-baked streets of Thebes or Memphis, a different reality existed. Here, in the taverns that doubled as brothels, often located near the great necropolises where the tombs of the nobles were being eternally constructed, prostitution flourished as a straightforward economic enterprise. The workers here were not priestesses. They were often slaves, war captives, or poor women with no other means of survival. The papyri that have survived from the New Kingdom period occasionally mention these women, not with moral outrage, but with a casual, almost bureaucratic detachment. They were part of the urban landscape. As much as the baker or the fisherman, the fragment of a satirical papyrus even depicts a drunken, lecherous soldier stumbling from one such establishment, a vignette of daily life. That suggests a society that accepted this level of commercial sex with a degree of wry humor, so long as it did not disrupt the established social order. This order was paramount. For the Egyptian elite, the primary unit of society was the family, and a man's legacy was secured through his legitimate heirs. The existence of commercial sex, therefore, served a social function. It provided an outlet for male desire outside the marital bond, theoretically protecting the sanctity of the lineage. There was no widespread concept of sin attached to the act itself. The concern was social and practical. A man could visit a prostitute without spiritual peril, but he risked gossip and domestic strife if he were indiscreet or spent the family's wealth too freely. The duality in Egypt, then, was not yet a moral one. It was a duality of context. The same act could be a sacred rite in the temple of Hathor and a simple commercial exchange in a riverside tavern, with the society drawing a clear, if unspoken, line between the two. It was along the coast of the Levant, among the Canaanites and their seafaring descendants, the Phoenicians, that the sacred dimension of temple sexuality reached its most intense and, to outside observers, its most troubling expression. Here, the old Mesopotamian traditions, curried by trade routes and cultural diffusion, found fertile ground in the worship of the great goddesses Astarte and Asherah. Their temples were powerful economic and religious institutions, central to the life of cities like Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon. The sensory experience of a Phoenician temple was overwhelming. The air was heavy with the smell of burning cedar wood and the iron tang of animal blood from the altars. The sound was a cacophony of chanting priests, the wail of double-reed pipes, and the constant lowing of sacrificial animals, and within this charged atmosphere, the Kadeshot, the sacred women, performed their duties. These women were consecrated to the goddess, and their sexual service was considered a direct form of worship. A man who came to the temple and made an offering to the goddess could then lie with one of her servants. This was not seen as licentiousness. It was a pious act. The silver paid was a temple donation, a votive offering, and the sexual union was a ritual meant to imitate and stimulate the goddess's own life-giving powers, ensuring the fertility of crops, herds, and people to walk through the crowded, chaotic temple precinct was to witness a thriving and very public religious commerce. It was this very publicness, this frank integration of sexuality into state religion, that would later scandalize the prophets of Israel, whose nascent monotheism defined itself in opposition to the abominations of their neighbors. For the Canaanites and Phoenicians, however, it was simply the way of the world, a transaction as natural as the merchant in the harbor trading purple dye for Spanish silver. But even here, the duality persisted. Beyond the temple gates, in the warrens of the lower city and down by the bustling, salt-sprayed docks, secular prostitution thrived. Sailors, after months at sea, disembarked with pay in their pockets and a desperate hunger for human contact. The women who worked the port districts of Tyre were not Kadeshot. They were businesswomen, often operating out of wine shops. Their transactions devoid of the sacred veneer of the temple, they were part of the essential infrastructure of a maritime trading empire, the service industry for a transient, predominantly male population. It is in the intersection of these two worlds, the sacred and the profane, the temple and the tavern, that the first faint strings of moral tension can be perceived. The issue was not the act of sex itself, but the flow of money and the challenge to social hierarchies. A cuneiform tablet from the nearby city of Ugarit tells the story of a man who brings a complaint against his mother, a Kadista, the equivalent of the Kadeshot, accusing her of taking family property into the temple for her own use. The case reveals the anxiety that could rise when a woman, through her sacred professional rule, amassed personal wealth and independence, potentially undermining the patriarchal family structure. This is the core of the emerging tension. Religion sanctified the act, but commerce could empower the woman, and that empowerment was often viewed with deep suspicion. The sacred courtesan, operating within the rigid confines of the temple, was controlled, her power channeled and contained for the benefit of the state and the gods. The independent prostitute, operating in the marketplace, was a wild card. Her earnings were her own. She was not under the direct authority of a father, a husband, or a high priest. She represented a form of female autonomy that existed outside the accepted structures. And, while it was tolerated as an economic necessity, it was rarely celebrated. The soundscape of an ancient Phoenician city at dusk encapsulates this entire complex reality. From the high citadel, One could hear the evening hymns drifting from the temple of Ostad, the voices of the priests and Kadeshot raised in solemn, rhythmic praise from the harbor below. The sounds were cruder, more vital, the raucous laughter from the wine shops, the clink of coins, the bargaining in a dozen different languages. Both sounds were essential to the city's life. One fed the soul and, it was believed, secured the favor of the gods for the merchant fleet's setting sail at dawn. The other fed the body and sated the immediate physical needs of the men who crewed those very ships. This was the delicate, often contradictory balance of the ancient world. The sacred and the profane were not yet enemies. They were uneasy neighbors, coexisting in a symbiotic relationship that was both pragmatic and spiritually resonant. The woman who served in the temple was elevated, her body a vessel for divine power. The woman who worked the docks was mundane, her body a commodity in a human marketplace. Yet a thread, however faint, connected them. Both were responding to the same fundamental human drives for connection, for transcendence, for survival. Both existed because the societies they lived in had not yet conceived of a world where sexuality could be entirely divorced from the divine, or where its commercial expression could be entirely erased. That conceptual revolution, the great sundering that would recast this ancient profession in an entirely new and enduring light, was waiting in the wings, brewing in the hills of Judea and the nascent city-states of Greece. But for now, in the twilight of the Bronze Age and the dawn of the Iron Age, the duality held, a complex and enduring dance between the temple and the tavern, between the will of the gods and the realities of the market. The sun in ancient Greece was a clarifying force, a brilliant, almost merciless light that bleached the marble of the Acropolis to a blinding white and cast sharp distinct shadows in the bustling agora where citizen men gathered to debate the affairs of the city-state. This was a world consciously dedicated to reason and order, to geometry and philosophy, a civilization that sought to impose harmony and proportion on everything from the graceful curve of a temple column to the governance of the human soul. Yet, beneath this polished surface of logic and civic virtue pulsed the same ancient, human currents of desire, power, and economic necessity that had flowed through Babylon and Egypt. In Greece, however, these currents were channeled into a uniquely structured, legally codified, and intellectually articulated system, one that would create a lasting and profound dichotomy in the Western imagination, the division of woman into distinct, immutable categories, and the paradoxical elevation of the courtesan to a status approaching cultural icon. 2. Understand the Greek approach to prostitution is to understand the fundamental architecture of their society, which was, in its essence, a fraternity of citizen men. The ideal woman, the djinn, a citizen wife, was the revered cornerstone of the oikos, the household. Her role was one of profound importance and profound seclusion. She was the manager of the domestic sphere, the bearer of legitimate heirs who would inherit property and civic rights, and the guardian of the family's sacred bloodline. Her virtue was not a personal attribute, but a civic one. Her guaranteed chastity ensured the legitimacy of the future citizens who would defend and govern the polis. Consequently, she lived a life largely removed from the public eye, confined to the shadowy, interior women's quarters of the home, the gynekonitis, her voice rarely heard in the streets, her body shrouded in layers of woolen cloth. She was respected, even essential, but she was not a companion in the modern sense. Her education was minimal, focused on domestic management, and her world was deliberately circumscribed by the loom, the child, and the kitchen for the Greek citizen man. The pursuit of intellectual stimulation, witty conversation, political networking, and sophisticated eroticism could not, and would not, be found within the respectable. Yet intellectually barren, confines of his marriage. This deliberate social schism gave rise to a meticulously stratified world of commercial sexuality, a hierarchy as rigid and well-defined as the class structure itself at its base. And by far the most numerous were the pornai, a word derived from panemi, meaning to sell, the root of our modern term pornography. These women were almost always slaves, owned by pornoboskoi brothel keepers and often housed in state-sponsored brothels, the Victorian, which in Athens was strategically located near the bustling Piraeus port. The existence of these brothels was a conscious matter of public policy, Solon. The great Athenian lawgiver was widely credited with their establishment, allegedly using the profits to fund the construction of a temple to Aphrodite Pandemos. The logic was purely pragmatic and utilitarian, to provide a safe, affordable and regulated outlet for the sexual urges of the city's men, particularly the vast population of sailors, merchants, laborers, and disenfranchised metics resident foreigners, thereby preserving the sanctity of citizen wives and reducing the threat of social unrest or adultery. The lives of the pornai were ones of unmitigated hardship. They worked in small, cramped, and airless cells. Their bodies a cheap, interchangeable commodity. Their price often no more than a handful of obols, the same as a loaf of bread. They had no legal rights, no personal autonomy, and were subject to the whims of their owners and clients. Their existence was a stark, daily reminder of the brutal reality underpinning the glittering ideals of Athenian democracy and economy, and a culture fundamentally dependent on human chattel. The city that gave the world democracy was also a city that openly traded in human flesh. And the pornai were at the very bottom of this brutal hierarchy. But above this grim and anonymous foundation existed another, more rarefied and celebrated tier, the hetairai, or companions. These were not common prostitutes. They were distinct social class, free women, often from foreign city-states like Miletus or Corinth, or born into citizen families fallen on hard times, who used their intellect, artistic talent, and meticulously cultivated charm to achieve a level of influence, wealth, and independence unimaginable for a citizen wife. The hetairai was not merely a seller of sex. She was a professional of the symposium, the all-male drinking party that served as the epicenter of Greek social, intellectual, and political life. It was here, in this exclusive masculine sphere, that her true value was realized. Imagine the scene within an andron, the men's dining room of a wealthy Athenian home, the walls painted with scenes of Dionysian revelry. The air is thick and hazy with the smell of roasted meat, spilled wine, and perfumed olive oil. Men recline on cushioned couches, their discourse fueled by wine diluted in large craters, ranging from the metaphysical philosophies of Plato to the practical politics of Pericles, from the latest poetic forms to the strategies of naval warfare. Into this intensely masculine sphere, the hetairai would enter, not as silent servants or decorative objects, but as active, often leading, participants. They were expected to be proficient in music, able to play the double-reeded aulos or the delicate lyre, to be conversant in literature, able to recite Homer or Sappho or compose witty, improvised epigrams of their own, to engage in philosophical debate and clever banter with the sharpest minds of the age. Their value was in their ability to provide not just physical pleasure, but intellectual and aesthetic stimulation. They were the muses and the interlocutors, the ones who could match a man's wit, challenge his ideas, and stoke his desires in equal measure. Their eroticism was not a furtive transaction in a dark alley, but a celebrated, public, and sophisticated art form, an integral part of the cultural performance of the symposium. A successful hetairai could command immense sums for a time, amass significant property, and live in her own home, operating as an independent businesswoman in a world that otherwise offered women few such. Opportunities. The most famous and illustrative of all was Aspasia of Miletus. She was the longtime partner and consort of Pericles, the leading statesman of Athens' Golden Age. Though she could not marry him due to her status as a foreigner, she was widely recognized as his intellectual equal and closest confidant. Her home became a renowned salon for the city's elite thinkers, artists, and politicians, including Socrates himself, who reportedly praised her wisdom and rhetorical skill and even joked that he had learned the art of oratory from her. Plutarch would later write that Pericles' great funeral oration, a foundational text of Western political philosophy and a brilliant piece of propaganda, was actually composed by Aspasia. She was, in effect, a foreign woman with no official political rights, who nonetheless exerted profound, tangible influence over the most powerful man in Athens and the cultural direction of the city itself. Her story exemplifies the unique, paradoxical space the hetairai could occupy, immensely influential and respected for her intellect, yet forever on the margins of official society, celebrated for her mind and spirit, yet never able to fully shed the social stigma of her profession. She was both central and peripheral, a power behind the throne who could never sit upon it. This Greek duality was profoundly reflected in their very pantheon. They worshipped a single goddess of love, Aphrodite, but in two distinct and often opposing aspects. Aphrodite Pandemos, Aphrodite of all the people, the goddess of common, physical, and commercial love, who was associated with the pornai and the state-run brothel, and Aphrodite Urania Heavenly Aphrodite, the goddess of celestial, intellectual, and spiritual love, who presided over the more refined and philosophical connection sought with the hetairai. This theological split perfectly encapsulated the Greek mind's relentless tendency to categorize and compartmentalize, to separate the base and common from the elevated and refined. Even within the complex and unified realm of Eros, it was a philosophical framework that justified a social reality, providing a divine mandate for a system that required different types of women for different types of love. The stark contrast with the austere, militaristic society of Sparta is profoundly instructive. In Sparta, the primary function of every individual, male or female, was to produce and sustain strong warriors for the perpetual defense of the state. Spartan women, as a result, enjoyed remarkable freedom and public visibility compared to their secluded Athenian counterparts. They were educated, trained in athletics to ensure they would bear healthy children, and were expected to manage estates and property while their husbands were almost permanently in military barracks. Or at war. This relative gender equality, however, did not extend to a celebration of the intellectualized courtesan or the commercial brothel, though. Spartan system focused entirely on communal discipline, austerity, and military readiness, had little time or tolerance for the luxurious, philosophical eroticism of the Athenian symposium. Their approach to sexuality and relationships was more direct, functional, and often framed round brutal eugenic principles, where women were encouraged to have children with the strongest men, regardless of marital status. For the good of the state, the concept of the hetairai woman valued for her wit, her music, and her conversation would have been as foreign and decadent to a Spartan as the idea of a sequestered, an educated wife was to them. This highlights a crucial historical lesson. The specific form and social role of prostitution was not an inevitable constant, but a direct and telling product of a society's core values, Athens' love of discourse, individual brilliance, and private luxury versus Sparta's cult of collective strength, discipline, and austere simplicity. The legacy of the Greek system, particularly the enduring figure of the hetairai, would echo for millennia, fundamentally shaping the Western world's relationship with intellect, desire, and the permissible roles for women. They established a powerful and persistent template that clearly separated the respectable wife and mother the guardian of the hearth and bloodline, from the fascinating mistress and companion. The partner for the mind and the senses. This deep schism would run like a permanent fault line through European history, resurfacing in the courtly love traditions of the Middle Ages, where the knight adored an unattainable noble lady, to the glittering salons of Enlightenment Paris, where witty, educated women like Madame de Pompadour held immense sway over kings and philosophers. The Greek hetairai was the direct forerunner of the Renaissance courtesan, the demi-mondaine of the 19th century, a figure who continually proved that a woman could be both sexually autonomous and intellectually formidable, that she could trade on her talents and charms to navigate a world that denied her formal power. Yet, for all its apparent glamour and intellectual appeal, this legacy is shadowed by a profound and enduring ambiguity. For all her cultivated influence and celebrated charm, the hetairei's position in society was always inherently precarious. Her status, wealth, and safety were entirely dependent on the continued favor and patronage of powerful, and often fickle, men. She could be celebrated and wealthy one day and cast aside, ridiculed, or impoverished the next. While she could potentially amass wealth and property, she could never be a full citizen, never hold official political office, and her children, even if fathered by a citizen, would typically be considered illegitimate and denied citizenship rights. She existed in a perpetual liminal space, both central to the cultural life of the city and peripheral to its official political structures. Simultaneously admired for her talents and subtly scorned for her refusal to conform to the only, to respectable female roles, wife or mother. She was a necessary and celebrated contradiction, a symbol of both female potential and its ultimate limitation within the ancient world. The long, slow, haunting notes of the orlos have faded into silence. The wine-drenched symposia are but dusty memories, but the profound questions raised in those smoke-filled Athenian rooms persist with remarkable vitality in creating the figure of the hetairai. The Greeks gave the world a powerful, seductive, and enduring archetype, the woman who leverages her intellect, education, and personal charm to navigate and negotiate a world not built for her autonomy. They presented a compelling vision where eroticism and philosophy could not just coexist but actively intertwine, where the pursuit of pleasure was not merely a physical release but a legitimate aesthetic and intellectual endeavor. In doing so, they bequeathed to the West a complex and deeply contradictory ideal, a dream of a perfect companion who was both a stimulating mind and an accessible body. A dream that would forever haunt the relationship between men and women, forever complicating the simple, brutal transaction of the pornai with the dazzling, complicated and ultimately unattainable promise of the companion. This duality, born in the clear Greek light, would cast a long and tangled shadow for centuries to come. The clear, intellectual light of Greece gave way to something harsher, more pragmatic, and vastly more ambitious. Rome was not a city of philosophers reclining in symposia. It was a city of engineers, soldiers, and administrators. Its rhythm set not by the cadence of poetic debate, but by the marching of legionary boots and the relentless chiseling of laws onto bronze. Here, on the 7 hills, amidst the smell of travertine dust and the cacophony of the forum, the ancient world's relationship with prostitution was forged into its most systematic, public, and legally codified form. In Rome, sex work was stripped of the last vestiges of its sacred Eastern origins. It was neither a divine right nor an intellectual pursuit, but a fundamental utility of state, a necessary industry to be managed with the same brutal efficiency as the grain dough or the aqueducts. It was, in the most literal sense, a matter of public works, an institutionalized release valve for the pressures of a vast, stratified, and militaristic society to understand the Roman approach. One must first comprehend the bedrock principle of Roman society, dignitas and infamia. Dignitas was the public reputation, the honor, the weight of a man and his family. Built over generations through military service and political office, its counterpart was infamia, a legal and social stain that attached to those in certain professions, actors, gladiators, and prostitutes. This was not a moral judgment in the modern, internal sense, but a public, civic classification. A registered prostitute, a meretrix, suffered infamia, which legally barred her from marrying a Roman citizen of senatorial rank and from providing testimony in court. Her body, and the use of it, had rendered her a figure of diminished public standing. This was the price of her trade, her formal, bureaucratic demotion that neatly segregated her from the world of respectable matrons. The Roman wife, the matrona, swat in her stola, was the embodiment of virtue and fertility, her life dedicated to the household gods, the lares and penates. Between the matrona and the meretrix stood an unbridgeable chasm, not of sin, but of civic status, a divide as concrete and impassable as the walls separating the private villa from the public street. The machinery of this separation was both bureaucratic and architectural, a testament to the Roman genius for organization and control. From at least the time of the Emperor Augustus, with his moral legislation, prostitution was not merely tolerated. It was regulated, taxed, and zoned with an almost clinical detachment. Prostitutes were required to register with the aediles, the city officials in charge of public buildings and festivals, and obtain a license, the licentia stupri. Their names were recorded in public ledgers, and in doing so, they formally entered the ranks of the infamous. The logic was impeccably Roman: to count, to control, to tax. The primary venue for their work was the lupina, the brothel. The word itself derived from lupa, she-wolf, the same term used for a prostitute, harking back to the myth of the she-wolf who suckled Romulus and Remus a potent. Feral symbol of a nature both nurturing and dangerously sexual. A foundational energy that the state now sought to channel and commodify. A lupina was not a place of hidden vice, but a public, and often squalid, commercial establishment, as much a part of the urban infrastructure as a tavern or a bakery. To step inside one, preserved in astonishing detail in the ash-embalmed city of Pompeii, was to enter a world of stark, brutal functionality. The building was often tucked away on a side street, a symbol of fertility and good fortune as much as a blatant advertisement. Inside, the air was close and heavy, smelling of cheap lamp oil, sweat, stale wine, and the faint, astringent scent of the public latrines nearby. The interior was a warren of tiny, cell-like rooms, each barely large enough for a stone bed frame topped with a thin, straw-stuffed mattress. The walls blackened by the smoke from countless smaller lamps. The walls were a palimpsest of human impulse, covered in graffiti, not the elaborate art of the symposium, but the crude, hurried scrawls of the clients themselves, carved or scrawled in charcoal. Here I came. One reads with simple directness, and I had a good time. Another boasts of his sexual prowess, while another laments the cost. Epiphra is a thief. One complains, a brief flash of a commercial dispute frozen in time. A price list was sometimes painted near the entrance, making the economics brutally clear. A few asses, the small bronze coins of the realm, for a few minutes of time. This was not an environment designed for pleasure or companionship. It was designed for throughput, a transactional space where the human body was reduced to a service for a fixed and low price, a cog in the vast, grinding machine of the city's economy. The women who worked in these places occupied the very bottom of a rigid, class-based structure that mirrored the society outside. At the lowest rung were the slaves, the ancilli, who were the property of the lino or lina, the pimp. They had no rights, no control over their earnings, and no choice in their clients. Their bodies were instruments for their owner's profit, and their lives were often short and brutal, a cycle of use and degradation that ended only with death or rarely. A freedom bought with coins they never touched. Above them were the free women, libertinae, who had gained their freedom but often had few other means of support. For them, prostitution could be a path to a precarious independence, a way to scrape together a living outside the domineering structure of a patron, a chance, however slim, to carve out a tiny domain of self-determination in a world that offered them few alternatives. And at the top were the high-class meretrices, the courtesans who might attract the patronage of wealthy equestrians or even senators. These women, like their Greek hetairai counterparts, could achieve significant wealth and influence. They might live in their own apartments in more fashionable districts, own slaves, and become figures of renown. Their names whispered with a mixture of scorn and fascination. The poet Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria, advised men on how to court these sophisticated women, warning them to avoid the crude brothels of the suburb and instead seek the company of the cultured courtesan. At the theatre or the games, where wit and elegance were as valued as physical beauty. Yet, regardless of their wealth or cultivation, their name was still on the register of the ediles. They still carried the indelible stain of infamia. Their influence was real, but it was a shadow influence, exercised in private villas and secluded gardens, never in the public light of the forum. They could shape the private thoughts of powerful men, but they could never share their public honors. This vast, sprawling industry was not a peripheral part of Roman life. It was woven into the very fabric of its economy and its imperial project, a direct consequence of its relentless expansion. The Roman army, the engine of conquest, was followed by a train of camp followers, including prostitutes who serviced the legions in makeshift canopy outside the fortified walls. In newly founded colonies and in great port cities like Ostia, brothels were as essential an amenity as a bathhouse or a basilica, a necessary service for a transient, predominantly male population. They serviced a massive demographic of soldiers, sailors, merchants, and slavesmen who were either unmarried or far from their families, for whom the comforts of a traditional household were a distant memory or an impossible dream. The taxes collected from prostitution, the vectigal ex lenibus, fed the state treasury, funding everything from road repairs to the donatives given to the Praetorian Guard to ensure their loyalty. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of remarkable efficiency. Conquest brought slaves, many of whom became prostitutes, whose labor generated revenue that funded further conquest, which in turn brought more slaves, the bodies of enslaved women, often captives from Gaul, Britain, Thrace, or the East, were a direct resource extracted from the provinces. A human tribute that lubricated the machinery of the empire itself, their suffering a silent, accepted subsidy for Roman power and peace. This created a profound and deeply ingrained double standard that lay at the heart of the Roman male psyche, a cognitive dissonance that was, for them, no dissonance at all. For the citizen, sexual activity was defined not by the act itself, but by the status of the participants and the role one played. To penetrate a slave, a prostitute, or a social inferior was a display of power, of virtue's manly virtue, a natural and accepted indulgence. The moral legislation of Augustus, the Lex Julia, did not seek to curb male sexuality. It sought to direct it, fiercely punishing adultery with a citizen much owner a crime against another man and his property, and the integrity of the citizen body while leaving relations with prostitutes and slaves largely untouched, even expected. A Roman senator could spend an evening in a lupanar with his favorite courtesan and rise the next morning to give a stern speech in the forum on traditional family values. And the moral decay of the Republic without a hint of perceived hypocrisy. The sin was not in the indulgence, but in the blurring of lines, in the threat to another man as dignitas, or the wasteful squandering of the family fortune on a particularly expensive meretrix. The body of the prostitute was a public utility, and using it was as morally neutral as drawing water from a public fountain. This stark duality is palpable in the very stones of Pompeii, a city frozen in a single, catastrophic moment. On the same narrow, cobbled street as a lupanar, one could find a bakery with its large millstones turned by donkeys, a folly where urine was used to treat cloth, and the imposing doorway of a wealthy merchant's house, its atrium decorated with exquisite frescoes of mythic heroes. The prostitute, the baker, the fuller, and the senator all existed in a shared, unblinking urban landscape, their lives intersecting in the crowded, noisy thoroughfares. The graffiti on the brothel wall was of the same vernacular language, the same hurried Latin, as the electoral notices painted on the street corners, urging citizens to vote for a particular candidate. I ask you to elect Gaius Julius Polybius as Duumvir. He bakes good bread. It was all part of the same commercial and civic tapestry, the grimy and the grand existing in intimate, unremitting proximity. The sounds of the city blended together into a constant hum, the clatter of looms from weavers' workshops, the cries of hawkers selling fish sauce and lentils, the murmur of bathers in the palaestra, the clinking of coins in the money changer's shop, and the brief transactional silences behind the heavy, curtained doorways of the lupanaria. Rome's great, enduring contribution to the history of prostitution was this relentless systemization. This application of an engineer's mindset to the messy realities of human desire. They took the recategories and built a comprehensive legal and administrative framework around them, creating a world where the most private of acts became a matter of public record, where desire was channeled into specific, zoned districts, and where the profits from the trade were funneled directly into the state's coffers. It was a cold, hard, practical arrangement, devoid of the sacred mystery of the East or the philosophical gloss of Greece. In the Roman mind, the body, like an aqueduct or a road, was a thing to be used, managed, and profited from. The vast, silent suffering of the slave in the lupanar was the dark, accepted cost of maintaining the public order, the pleasure of the citizen, and the relentless, expanding power of the empire. It was a world where the pursuit of pleasure and the exercise of power were, ultimately, one and the same, two sides of the same denarius, spent in the relentless, pragmatic economy of an empire built to last. The great stone cathedrals of the Middle Ages reached for the heavens, their spires piercing the low, leaden skies of Europe. Within, the air was cold and still, heavy with the scent of old incense and beeswax. Light, filtered through stained glass the color of wine and blood, fell in slanted, jewel-toned shafts upon the kneeling figures of the faithful. Here, the priest's voice echoed off vaulted ceilings, a sonorous drone detailing the topography of sin. He spoke of the flesh, this temporary, corruptible vessel that housed the immortal soul, a thing of base desires that threatened to eternally separate man from God. Lust was a fire that could reduce the spirit to ashes, and chaste thoughts were as damning as unchaste acts. The body was a temple, he insisted, but one perpetually under siege from within. This was the official and yielding doctrine of the Church, the spiritual bedrock upon which medieval society was, in theory, built. And yet, just beyond the cathedral's great oak doors, the world was a muddle of compromise and necessity. The same town whose life was ordered by the ringing of church bells, whose feast days and fasts were dictated by the liturgical calendar, also conducted its business in the grimy, vital reality of the marketplace. Here, the air was thick with the smells of roasting meat, dung, and the damp wool of crowded humanity. The cobblestone streets, slick with rain and refuse, echoed with the cries of hawkers, the clatter of cartwheels, and the lowing of beasts being driven to slaughter. It was in this world, in the narrow, shadowed alleys that ran like capillaries between the main thoroughfares, that the oldest profession persisted, caught in a perpetual and paradoxical dance with the very faith that condemned it, for the medieval church, grappling with the seemingly intractable reality of prostitution, had forged a complex and deeply contradictory philosophy. It was a necessary evil, this concept, articulated by theologians like St. Augustine and later refined by Thomas Aquinas, became the uneasy foundation upon which the medieval attitude towards sex work was built. The reasoning was as pragmatic as it was grim. The Church Fathers, observing the violent impulses of men, argued that to eradicate prostitution entirely would be to invite a greater cataclysm of sin. It was, in Augustine's famous analogy, like a sewer in a palace. If you removed the sewer, the entire palace would be fouled. Better to channel the filth into a designated conduit than to have it overflow and corrupt everything. Prostitution, therefore, was the sewer that preserved the sanctity of the social order, preventing the greater sins of adultery, rape, and the sodomy that so terrified the medieval mind. It was a sin, yes, a mortal one for the woman who sold her body and the man who bought it. But it was a sin that prevented other, seemingly worse, societal collapses. The woman was a sacrificial figure, absorbing the moral pollution of the community to protect its respectable wives and daughters, her soul was damned so that the social fabric, however stained, might remain intact. This theological contradiction manifested in the physical landscape of the burgeoning medieval town. From the 12th century onward, as trade revived and urban centers swelled with a new, mobile population of merchants, students, and laborers, municipal authorities began to formally regulate prostitution. They did not seek its elimination, but its containment. The most striking innovation of this era was the official, licensed municipal brothel, often known as a stew or stew house, a term borrowed from the public bathhouses where such activities had long been associated. To find one of these establishments was to follow a path of deliberate, if discreet, signage. They were often situated on the literal periphery of the community, on a specific street, or across a particular bridge, places like the Bankside in London, south of the Thames and outside the city's direct jurisdiction, or the Rue du Phare in Paris. This legal segregation was both a moral and a practical statement. It physically embodied the woman's status as an outsider, a permanent resident of the social and spiritual margins, while also making her services locatable and controllable. The law often dictated that these women wear specific items of clothing: a striped hood, a yellow scarf, a particular type of ribbon, rendering them instantly identifiable in the crowded streets, a walking symbol of their trade and their sin. A medieval stew house was a world unto itself, a sensory universe far removed from the quiet reverence of the cathedral. Imagine a low-ceilinged, timber-framed building, its windows shuttered against the night and the prying eyes of the righteous. The air inside was thick and hot, heavy with the smoke from a central hearth and the pungent aroma of cheap tallow candles, which guttered and spat, casting a wavering, orange light upon the scene. The floor was strewn with rushes that had long since lost any freshness, now mingled with the sense of spilled ale, sweat, and perfumes meant to mask them. Here, the sounds were not hymns, but the raucous laughter of men, the clatter of dice and drinking horns on wooden tables, and the low, murmured negotiations of business. The women who worked here were not free agents, but were almost always under the control of a board or a brothel keeper. Often a man who paid a hefty annual license fee to the town council for the privilege of operating his business. This license brought the women a paradoxical form of protection. In return for their payment and adherence to certain rules, they could not solicit outside their designated area. They could not rob their clients outright. And they were often subject to periodic medical examinations. However rudimentary, the municipal authorities guaranteed them a degree of safety from random violence or arbitrary arrest. They were, in a twisted sense, institutionalized. Their bodies became a source of municipal revenue, a taxable commodity. The city of Toulouse, for instance, famously owned its public brothel, the Grand Maison Commune, and its profits contributed directly to the public coffers, the church, too. As a major landowner and temporal power, often collected rents from properties used as stews. A quiet hypocrisy that fueled the coffers of dioceses even as their priests thundered against the sin from the pulpit. This economic dimension was inextricable from the moral one. The medieval economy was one of scarcity and rigid social hierarchy, for a woman with no inheritance, no dowry, and no male protector. The options were brutally limited. She could enter a convent if she had the means, become a low-paid domestic servant subject to the whims of her master, or face a life of grueling poverty wage labor as a spinster or brewer. For many, the stew house, for all its damnation and danger, offered a path to survival that was, in purely material terms, more secure. The money was better, and it was cash in hand. Some women even managed to save enough to eventually leave the life, pay a fine for their sin, and marry. Their pasts, if not forgotten, at least officially absolved. This was the stark choice, a life of virtuous destitution or a life of sinful sustenance. The church might preach the glories of poverty, but the cold, hard reality of an empty belly and a threadbare cloak made such abstractions a luxury few could afford. The relationship between the church and the brothel was not, however, merely one of condemnation and taxation. It was a more intimate and more psychologically complex dance. The same woman who was denounced as a vessel of sin on Sunday might, on Monday, be a penitent seeking absolution. It was not uncommon for brothel workers to be compelled to attend weekly sermons specifically designed for their moral correction, where they were lectured on the fate of their souls. Some religious orders, particularly the Franciscans, made outreach to these women a special mission, attempting to rescue them and place them in penitential houses known as Magdalene laundries, where they could atone for their sins through prayer and hard labor. These institutions, named for the redeemed prostitute Saint Mary Magdalene, offered a way out, but it was an escape into a life of severe penance and confinement, an exchange of one form of servitude for another, sanctified one. The figure of Mary Magdalene herself loomed large over the medieval understanding of the prostitute. She was the archetype of the fallen woman who could be saved through Christ's grace. In ut and sermon, she was depicted in her vanity, then in her repentance. Her long hair used to dry Christ's feet, becoming a symbol of her abject humility. She offered a flicker of hope, a narrative that every sinner, no matter how debased, could be redeemed. But this very hope reinforced the core belief that the prostitute's existence was one of profound spiritual sickness, a state from which she needed to be saved. It was a cycle of sin and salvation that kept the woman perpetually in a state of debt, first to the brothel keeper, then to God. Life for the medieval sex worker was a precarious tightrope walk between social utility and personal peril. When she remained within the sanctioned boundaries of the Stowhouse district, she was tolerated, her trade unofficially sanctioned. But this tolerance was fragile and could shatter in an instant. In times of social stress, a plague, a famine, a military defeat, the prostitute along with other marginal figures like Jews and lepers, became a convenient scapegoat. She could be accused of spreading disease, of poisoning wells, of consorting with the devil. The same authorities who licensed her business could swiftly turn on her, expelling her from the city or subjecting her to public whipping or the stocks, her body, which served as a pressure valve for societal tensions, could also become the focus for their violent release. The quiet hypocrisies of medieval life were thus woven into its very fabric. The wealthy merchant who donated a stained glass window to the cathedral might, on his way home, stop by the licensed stew he owned as a silent business partner. The pious town councillor who helped pass ordinances against lewd behavior also voted to renew the brothel keeper's license, recognizing the revenue it brought. The university student, training for a life in the church, might pen lyrical verses about the Virgin Mary's purity by day and venture into the forbidden streets by night. This was not necessarily seen as rank hypocrisy, but rather as the messy, imperfect functioning of a world steeped in sin. Everyone was a sinner. The prostitute's sin was simply more public, more professionally organized. As the late Middle Ages waned, giving way to the early modern period, this delicate equilibrium began to fracture. The Black Death of the 14th century, which wiped out a third of Europe's population, created labor shortages that, paradoxically, offered some poor women new economic opportunities, making the desperate choice of prostitution less inevitable. New currents of religious reform, preaching a more personal and austere piety, began to challenge the Church's pragmatic acceptance of the necessary evil, began to be seen by a growing number of moralists as a festering sore that needed to be cauterized. Not merely managed, but for centuries the medieval model held, a testament to humanity's endless capacity for moral compromise. It was a world where the echo of the psalm could be drowned out by the laughter from the stew house across the river, where the same hand that dropped a coin in the alms box might later drop one into the palm of a woman wearing a yellow scarf. In the dim, candlelit interior of the brothel, and in the vast, echoing silence of the cathedral, the same human drama was playing out a story of desire and denial, of survival and sin, of a society trying and perpetually failing to reconcile the demands of the spirit with the undeniable urges of the flesh. The prostitute stood at the very heart of this contradiction, a permanent resident of the shadowlands between damnation and necessity. Her body a silent testament to the prices society was willing to pay for its own stability. The slow, sinuous curve of a canal in Venice, at the hour when the sun begins its descent, does not merely reflect the light, but seems to drink it. Holding the molten gold of the late afternoon in its watery embrace, the Victorians of the palaces that rise directly from the water are no longer stark white Istrian stone or warm pink brick, but are now gilded, their every window, every fluted column, every carved balcony rendered in a soft, fiery glow. This is a city built on water and on wealth, a precarious, glorious republic whose fortunes are woven from the silk and spice trades, from the relentless, cunning application of finance. And in this city, where reality is so often masked by its own brilliant reflection, a new kind of woman emerges from the shadows, a figure as complex and captivating as the city itself, the courtesan, the Renaissance. That great reawakening of European culture was not merely a rebirth of classical learning and artistic form. It was, fundamentally, a rebirth of the body. After the long medieval winter, when the flesh was viewed as a corrupt vessel for a trapped soul, the humanist gaze turned outward, toward the tangible, the visible, the beautifully proportioned, in the rediscovered philosophies of Plato and the unearthed statues of antiquity. The intellectuals and artists of the 14th to 16th centuries found a new gospel, that physical. Beauty was not a distraction from the divine, but the pathway to it, The perfect human form was a reflection of cosmic harmony, and to celebrate it in art, in poetry, in life itself, was an act of reverence. This seismic shift in consciousness did not erase the concept of sin, but it layered it with a new, potent aestheticism. Desire, once a fire to be extinguished, could now be seen as a spark of the sublime. In the teeming, polyglot heart of Venice, or the burgeoning intellectual salons of Paris and Rome, this new philosophy created a space for a previously unthinkable archetype, the educated, cultured, and immensely profitable courtesan. She was a world apart from the anonymous, licensed women of the medieval stews, where they were segregated and stigmatized. She was sought after and celebrated. Her trade was not merely in the physical act, but in the entire theater of her being. She sold conversation, wit, musical talent, and an aura of refined sensuality. She was, in the most literal sense, a humanist project, a self-fashioned individual whose body and mind were her capital, and whose success was measured in the currency of influence and luxury, to be in the presence of Veronica. Franco or Atelier d'Aragona was to encounter a masterpiece of personal creation. Her home was not a smoky, low-ceilinged house, but an apartment adorned with fine furniture, velvet drapes, and perhaps a painting by a master she counted among her acquaintances. The air would be scented with citrus and ambergris, not tallow smoke. She did not wear the mandated yellow scarf of the common prostitute, but gowns of deep crimson damask or cloth of silver, her neck adorned with pearls, symbols of the moon and the waters, which were believed to hold powers of seduction. She could recite Petrarchan sonnets, play the lute, and engage in spirited debates on philosophy and politics. Her value was inextricably linked to her perceived exclusivity and her cultural literacy. To be seen with her was to signal one's own wealth, taste, and worldliness. The transaction was blurred, elevated into a form of patronage. The client was not just a man purchasing a service, but a connoisseur appreciating a rare and beautiful object, a participant in a cultured exchange. This world of artifice and allure found its perfect stage in the Venetian Carnivale and the masquerade balls of the French court. In these spaces, the mask was everything. It was a liberator, a silken barrier between the individual and the rigid hierarchies of the day. A baker could rub shoulders with a nobleman, a merchant's wife could flirt with a knight. And for the courtesan, the mask was the ultimate tool of her trade. It granted her a provisional, magical form of equality. Behind the porcelain volto or the simple black baruta, her identity was fluid. She was not a citizen of a particular class or a daughter of a specific family. She was pure persona, an embodiment of desire and mystery, the rustle of silk, the whisper of a fan, the glimpse of a painted eye through the slits of a mask. These were the currencies of this nocturnal economy, in the flickering torchlight of a palazzo ballroom, where the music of viols and the scent of hundreds of perfumed bodies mingled in the warm air. The lines between art and life, between the performance of desire and its consummation, dissolved into a heady, intoxicating haze. It was in the realm of art, however, that the courtesan achieved her most enduring form of legitimacy. The painters of the Renaissance, funded by wealthy merchants, bankers, and princes, were the era's image makers, its mythologists, and repeatedly they turned to the courtesan as their model. She was not merely a cheap muse. She was a professional collaborator. When Titian painted his so-called Venus of Urbino, he was not depicting a goddess from a distant myth, but a contemporary woman, her gaze direct, unashamed, and intimately familiar, reclining in a Venetian bedroom. The painting is a symphony of textures, the soft, warm luminosity of her skin against the crisp white sheets, the rich velvet of the curtain, the deep, fur-lined darkness of the background. This is not a medieval allegory of sin, but a celebration of sensual pleasure as a natural, beautiful, and domestic reality. The woman's identity is debated, but her type is unmistakable. She is a courtier. Her body rendered with a reverence previously reserved for the Virgin Mary. This normalization of the erotic through classical allegory was a masterstroke of artistic subterfuge. A painting could be titled Dinah or Leda, the Swan. The subject was divine, but the body, the face, the very atmosphere of sensual abandon were thoroughly, recognizably human. The patrons who commissioned these works, often the same men who frequented the company of courtesans, could thus hang their desires on the wall. Sanctified by the brushstrokes of a genius, art became a mirror that reflected their own lives back at them, but refined, elevated, and justified by the authority of classical antiquity and artistic genius, the courtesan, in lending her form to these goddesses and nymphs, was not damned. She was immortalized. Yet, for all this apparent liberation, the courtesan's position was one of breathtaking precarity, a high-wire act performed over an abyss of ruin. The same society that celebrated her could discard her in an instant. The wealth was immense, but it was fleeting, dependent on the continued favor of powerful, fickle men, a change in political wind, the rise of a puritanical religious faction like the Counter-Reformation Church, the loss of her beauty to age or disease, or simply the whims of a capricious patron could spell disaster. The lavish palaces, the jewels, the adoring poems, these were not signs of integration, but the trappings of a gilded cage. She existed in a legal and social limbo. She was not a wife, the respected mother of legitimate heirs, bound by the strictures of chastity and obedience, nor was she a common whore, relegated to the designated streets. She was something in between, a category of one, whose power was entirely personal and thus terrifyingly fragile, the poetry of the era captures. This duality with poignant clarity, Pietro Aretino, the scandalous, sharp-tongued satirist and a friend to many courtesans, could write verses that celebrated their wit and sensuality, placing them at the center of the vibrant intellectual life of Rome and Venice. Yet, his own writings also detail the vulgar, transactional realities that underpin the glittering foade and the courtesans themselves. Sometimes seized the pen, Veronica Franco, in her published letters and poems, fiercely defended the intelligence and dignity of women in her profession, while also laying bare the constant anxieties, the threats of violence, and the profound loneliness that accompanied her celebrated status. In one poem, she warns a younger woman of the life's perils, describing it as a bitter, poisonous food. Her home was a sanctuary of art and music, but it was also a fortress, requiring the constant performance of a flawless and desirable self. The legacy of the Renaissance courtesan is thus a paradox, as layered and contradictory as a Venetian palazzo whose splendid front conceals damp, crumbling foundations. She was a product of a unique moment when unprecedented wealth, a new philosophy of the body, and a revolutionary artistic vision converged. She demonstrated that female sexuality, when coupled with intellect and cultural agency, could be a source of immense power and influence in a world that officially denied women both. For a fleeting historical moment, she forced a renegotiation of the boundaries between commerce and art, between sin and aesthetic appreciation. But the ground beneath her was always shifting, as the Renaissance gave way to the more rigid, moralistic atmosphere of the Counter-Reformation and the absolutist states of the 17th century. The space for such a public, celebrated figure began to shrink. The mask of classical allegory would remain, but the real, breathing, thinking woman behind it would be pushed back into the shadows, her complexity reduced, her voice silenced, her image once again becoming a simple object from male consumption, stripped of its disquieting and powerful agency. The canals of Venice would still glow at sunset, but the reflections would grow darker, holding the memory of a time when beauty, desire, and commerce had intertwined to create a figure of such dazzling, dangerous ambiguity. The 19th century was an age of iron and steam, a symphony of progress played on a scale never before imagined. Great locomotives, breathing plumes of black smoke into heavens once the domain of birds and angels, now stitched continents together with ribbons of steel. Beneath their tracks, in the newly dug, sulphurous tunnels of the London Underground, humanity moved in a perpetual, soot-stained twilight, a subterranean reflection of the world above. The cities London, Paris, New York swelled into vast, teeming organisms of brick and mortar, their populations doubling, tripling, drawing in a relentless tide of hopeful and desperate souls from the countryside. In the West End of London, along Baron Haussmann's grand, surgically imposed boulevards in Paris, and in the burgeoning, audacious landscape of Gilded Age New York, gas lamps flickered to life at dusk, their hissing. Jaundiced light did not so much illuminate as carve out precarious pools of visibility in a greater sea of darkness, a perfect metaphor for the Victorian age itself, an era that shone a brilliant, focused beam on progress, industry, and public morality, so that the vast, unseemly, and pulsating human reality could be pushed into the alleys, the attics, and the shadows out of sight, but never, ever truly gone. This was the age of the double standard, codified into the very fabric of society, as rigid and constricting as the whalebone cassettes that defined the female silhouette. Public life was a meticulous performance of impeccable virtue. The ideal woman, the angel in the house, was a creature of the domestic sphere, pious, pure, submissive, and devoid of carnal appetite. Her sexuality was not so much dormant as officially non-existent. She was a passive vessel, a moral compass, a serene icon whose purpose was to inspire her husband and bear his children. For the middle and upper class man, however, a different and spoken set of rules applied. His nature was understood to be inherently, aggressively lustful, a biological force that required an outlet beyond the sacred. Sanitized space of the conjugal bed, this profound schism in the social order created a fissure, through which the oldest profession would not only flow, but would swell into an immense, subterranean economy. Prostitution was the necessary and spoken corollary to the cult of female purity. It was the sewer, in St. Augustine's old analogy, that kept the splendid palace of Victorian marriage from being fouled by the very nature of the man who ruled it. And so, as the sunset and the gas lamps began their sibilant song, the second nocturnal city awoke in London, the Strand and the Haymarket transformed into a vast, open-air market of flesh here, under the same gaseous glow that guided respectable families to the theatre. Thousands of women stood, walked, or leaned in doorways, their faces painted with cheap cosmetics that took on a ghastly, theatrical hue in the jaundiced light. They were a hierarchy of desperation and ambition. There was the destitute gutter drab, her clothes thin and mud-spattered, who slept in a penny hang for a night's shelter, or, worse, on the damp embankment of the Thames. Her life is short. Brutal struggle against starvation, violence, and disease. There was the slightly more fortunate streetwalker, who might afford a rented room for an hour in a Warren-like lodging house, the air thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and damp plaster. And then there was the kept woman, installed in a private house in a discreet neighborhood like St. John's Wood, her existence a poorly kept secret among the wealthy men who funded it. Her life a gilded cage of waiting and performance, The brothel culture of the era was a mirror of the class structure it serviced. In Paris, the Messins de Tolerance, licensed and regulated by the prefecture of police, operated with the bureaucratic efficiency of a modern corporation. At the bottom were the squalid Messins de Passé for quick, anonymous transactions. Higher up were the establishments that catered to specific, catalogued tastes. Their specialties whispered in gentlemen's clubs, and at the apex were the legendary Messins de Luxe, like the famous 1 to 2, where women often posed in elaborate, static tableau vivants mimicking classical art, were presented to a wealthy, exclusive clientele. The air in these places was thick with the competing scents of expensive perfume, fine cigar smoke, and the faint, cloying sweetness of absinthe. It was a world of exquisite, cynical artifice, a direct commercial counterpart to the repressed and orderly drawing rooms of the bourgeoisie. In New York, the Tenderloin district thrived with a similar brazen energy, its concert saloons and parlor houses flaunting a garish prosperity, while in the Five Points, poverty and vice intertwined in a desperate, violent dance, the relentless engine that drove this vast, multi-tiered industry was the brutal, impersonal logic of industrial capitalism for the legions of poor, working-class women flooding into the cities. The choice was often not between virtue and vice, but between different forms of exploitation. A seamstress or a matchgirl might work 16 hours a day in a deafening factory or dim, Ellis Garrett, her lungs filling with textile dust or the poisonous phosphorus fumes that caused farcy joy, only to earn a pittance that barely kept her alive. The body, in this new industrial order, was a machine to be used until it broke. Prostitution, for many, was simply a more lucrative, if far more dangerous, way to rent out that same body. A single night could yield what a month of honest, back-breaking labor could not. It was a rational, if desperate, economic decision in a world that offered women of a certain class few other paths to survival, let alone advancement. The great social investigator Henry Mayhew, in his monument to London labour and the London poor, documented these lives with a journalist's dispassionate eye, recording the voices of women who spoke of going on the town not as a fall from grace, but as a simple, grim calculation in an arithmetic of survival. This visible, teeming population of fallen women became a persistent, nagging obsession for the Victorian conscience. They were walking, breathing contradiction to the myth of universal progress and moral order, a stain on the clean linen of society. And so, a great wave of reform movements rose, aimed at both salvation and social control. Philanthropists, often driven by a fervent, muscular evangelical Christian faith, established Magdalene asylums, these institutions, named for the redeemed prostitute of the Bible, offered refuge in exchange for prayer, penitence, and endless, grueling labor in industrial laundries, an attempt to scrub the women clean, both physically and spiritually. The language used was one of rescue and Christian charity, but the process was one of punishment and rigid discipline, designed to break the will and instill a proper, lasting sense of shame, to remold them into silent, servile domestics, more pernicious, because it was enshrined in law, was the governmental response, which reached its apogee in the United Kingdom with the Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s. Under these acts, in certain designated garrison and port towns, any woman merely suspected of being a prostitute could be summarily summoned by the police to undergo a forcible, invasive medical examination for venereal disease. If found to be infected, she could be confined against her will for months in a lock hospital, a grim prison infirmary. The acts were framed as a pragmatic matter of public health, necessary to protect the fighting strength of the British Army and Navy, but they were founded on a breathtakingly misogynistic premise, that men were mere, almost innocent, vectors of disease, while women were the source, the reservoir of infection. A man's patronage of a prostitute was a private, if regrettable, act. The woman herself was a public nuisance, a pathogen to be identified, examined, and quarantined. The acts did not criminalize the client, only the woman, turning her body into a site of state-sanctioned medical surveillance and violent intrusion. It was this blatant, legislated injustice that galvanized one of the first great feminist political movements in history, led by the indomitable Josephine Butler, a woman of immense courage and moral clarity. The Ladies' National Association for the Repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts launched a furious, 2-decade-long campaign. Butler, speaking to crowds who are often horrified and hostile at the sight of a respectable woman discussing such indelicate topics in public, argued with fierce logic and searing empathy. She framed the acts not merely as a health issue, but as a fundamental violation of the constitutional rights of poor women, who could be branded and punished on their suspicion. She forced Victorian society to stare directly at the hypocrisy it had so carefully cultivated, exposing the brutal reality that the state was effectively licensing vice from men while persecuting the W. Women who were its inevitable victims. The movement was a long, bitter, and deeply personal struggle. Butler faced immense social ostracism and violent threats, but its eventual success in suspending the acts was a monumental testament to the power of organized, principled resistance against the patriarchal state. The prostitute, in the Victorian imagination, was more than just a social problem. She was a potent literary and artistic troupe, a screen upon which the era projected its deepest anxieties about class, gender, and sexuality. She was the tragic, doomed figure of Emile Zola's Inanna, whose destructive, animalistic sexuality consumes the men around her and leads to her own grotesque, poetic death from smallpox. She was the pitiable, golden-hearted Nancy in Dickens's Oliver Twist, a beacon of innate goodness in the criminal underworld, whose brutal murder is both inevitable and strangely redemptive. In the paintings of the pre-Raphaelites and the illustrators of penny dreadfuls, she was depicted with a characteristic mixture of prurience and pity, her fallen state often signaled by a cascade of blue, say, red hair and a certain wistful, faraway expression, serving as both a moral warning and a secret fantasy all at once. Beneath the rustle of silk skirts, the authoritative clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones, and the solemn, measured pronouncements from pulpit and parliament, the reality of the Victorian sex trade was a story of profound, unbridgeable class division. For the wealthy, educated man, vice was a discreet transaction, a private indulgence comfortably removed from his public life and reputation. All proves the erotic photography that was a booming, clandestine business, all without a blemish on his social standing. For the poor woman, however, it was a raw matter of daily survival, conducted in the cold and the damp, under the constant, looming threat of violence from clients, disease with no cure. The rest under vagrancy laws and permanent social annihilation. The crack in the pristine veneer of Victorian values was not a small, manageable fissure. It was a chasm, and into it fell the lives and hopes of countless women, their individual stories a silent, searing indictment of an age that worshipped progress and flight, while its economy and its morals depended on the maintenance of the darkest shadows. The gaslight era, for all its manufactured brilliance, ultimately cast the longest and most revealing darkness. The 20th century did not arrive with a single, dramatic crash, but with a series of accelerating tremors that would, in time, fracture the very foundations of the old order. The gas lamps, with their soft, particulate glow, were gradually replaced by the hard, electric glare of the arc light and, later, the seductive, humming pulse of neon. This new light was a different kind of magic, It was not a flame to be tended, but a current to be switched on and off. A symbol of a world entering an age of unprecedented speed, power, and fragmentation. The steady, clopping rhythm of the horse-drawn carriage was drowned out by the sputtering engine of the automobile, a machine that promised and delivered a new kind of anonymity and mobility. And in the burgeoning metropolises of Europe and America, a new sound began to percolate up from basement clubs and dance halls, the syncopated, restless, and thrillingly dissonant rhythm of jazz. A musical form that seemed to give voice to the modern psyche itself and more, improvisational and vibrating with a new kind of desire. It was against this backdrop of technological and cultural upheaval that the ancient practice of prostitution would undergo its own profound transformation. Moving from a matter of simple sin or social necessity to a complex issue of public health, criminal law, and psychological identity, the 20th century would become the era of medicalization, where the fallen woman of Victorian morality was re-diagnosed, first as a vector of disease, then as a psychological type, and finally as a social problem to be managed by the state. The first great catalyst for this shift was the mechanized slaughter of the First World War. The conflict mobilized millions of young men, uprooting them from their villages and towns and depositing them into a transient, liminal world of training camps, troop ships, and the front lines, a world where the fear of imminent death eroded the inhibitions and moral structures of civilian life. Military authorities, haunted by the specter of venereal disease decimating their fighting strength more effectively than enemy artillery, embarked on a massive, global campaign of medical policing. Posters with stark, frightening imagery warned soldiers of the perils of the loose woman, who was depicted not as a pitiable sinner, but as a dangerous agent of decay. In France, the Messins Tolley saw a brutal resurgence, operating under strict military supervision, with women subjected to relentless, humiliating medical inspections. The prostitute's body was no longer just a site of moral failing. It was now a battlefield in a war against microscopic enemies, a potential weak link in the chain of national defense. This militarization of sexuality created a lasting legacy. The state's interest in the sex trade was now firmly, and seemingly permanently, framed in the cold, clinical language of hygiene and contagion in the roaring decade that followed the war's end. The public face of commercial sex began to mutate. The Victorian streetwalker, braving the elements, was now joined by a new figure, the woman who worked in the ambient, sensuous gloom of the jazz club or the speakeasy. Prohibition in the United States, by driving drinking underground, had the unintended consequence of creating a thriving, illicit economy in which the sale of alcohol and the sale of sex became naturally intertwined. In these hidden spaces, filled with the smoke of cheap cigarettes and the scent of bootleg gin, the transaction became more fluid, more ambiguous. A woman might be a dancer, a companion, a drink peddler, or a prostitute, her roles blending into one another under the cover of dim lights and loud music. The architecture of vice adapted, in cities like Hamburg or Amsterdam, the classic, consolidated red light district, with its neon-lit windows, became a fixed feature of the urban landscape, a carefully contained zone of commercialized desire that both acknowledged and quarantined the trade. This new visibility was met with a new form of anxiety. The early 20th century saw the birth of the modern moral panic, a phenomenon amplified by the burgeoning power of the popular press. Sensationalist headlines decried white slavery, a lurid myth of innocent girls being kidnapped and forced into sexual bondage, which tapped into deep-seated fears about urbanization, immigration, and the changing role of women. These narratives, while largely fictional, were powerful enough to spur international treaties and new, draconian laws, such as the American Mann Act of 1910. which made it a felony to transport a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. The discourse had shifted from saving the fallen woman to policing the mobile woman, the woman who, like the air itself, seemed to be moving too fast and without a clear destination. The Second World War repeated and intensified the dynamics of the First, but on a truly global scale. From London to Tokyo, from Naples to Manila, the presence of millions of soldiers and the massive social dislocations of total war created an unprecedented demand for commercial sex. The most stark and brutal manifestation of this was the Seidoku or comfort women system, a project of mass, militarized sexual slavery established by the Imperial Japanese Army, in which hundreds of thousands of women, predominantly from Korea and other occupied territories, were forced into a life of relentless brutality. This was prostitution stripped of even the pretense of choice or commerce, reduced to its most horrific, weaponized form, a tool of military policy and national subjugation in Europe and America. The figure of the victory girl, patriote emerged, a young woman who, motivated by a complex mix of patriotism, adventure, and the loosened morals of wartime, willingly consorted with soldiers, blurring the lines between romance, recreation, and transaction. The war, in all its facets, further normalized the idea that male sexuality was a force that required a managed, institutional outlet. The post-war period, with its desperate yearning for stability and its cult of domesticity, sought to push these uncomfortable realities back into the shadows. The suburban ideal of the nuclear family, enshrined in picket fence mythology, left little room for the public acknowledgement of commercial sex. Yet, the forces that would explode this consensus were already gathering. The twin revolutions of cinema and advertising began to reframe sexuality itself, not as a private act or a public vice, but as a commodity, a core component of personal identity and social success. Hollywood films, while operating under the strictures of the Hays Code, dripped with a sublimated eroticism. The movie star became an object of mass desire, their glamour a product to be consumed. Advertising learned to sell everything from cars to cigarettes by associating them with attractive, often scantily clad, bodies. This constant, pervasive commercial stimulation of desire created a society that was at once more sexually charged and more sexually confused than any before it. It was psychology, particularly the rising influence of Freudian and related theories, that provided the new lexicon for this confusion. The prostitute was no longer simply a victim of poverty or a creature of sin. She was now a psychological case study. She might be a nymphomaniac, driven by a pathological and insatiable appetite, or a neurotic, acting out a childhood trauma. Her client, too, came under the analyst's gaze, a man potentially suffering from latent homosexuality, Madonna Hall complex, or a deep-seated fear of intimacy. This medicalization had a double edge. On one hand, it could generate a more sympathetic, or at least nuanced, understanding of the individuals involved, moving the discussion beyond simple moral condemnation. On the other, it pathologized them, creating new categories of deviance that required expert intervention and correction. The question was no longer, is she sinful, but is she sick? By the century's end, the landscape of sex work had become a mosaic of these competing forces. The lingering structures of criminalization, the pervasive language of psychology, the relentless commercialization of desire, and the nascent strings of a new kind of political consciousness. The red light districts, now illuminated by the cold, mesmerizing glow of neon, stood as permanent monuments to an enduring demand. While in the academic journals and the early forums of the internet, a new debate was beginning to form, one that would question the very definitions of sin, crime, and sickness, and would instead begin to frame the issue in the stark, uncompromising language of labor, rights, and agency. The 20th century had taken the oldest profession and subjected it to the full force of modernity, dissecting it, analyzing it, and commercializing it, but it had not managed to eradicate it. Instead, it had set the stage for the next great and ongoing confrontation, the post-World War II economic boom, particularly in the United States, created a consumer society of unprecedented scale, a society where identity itself became a project to be assembled from available products and images. This new affluence was predicated on the constant, careful stimulation of want and advertising, now wielding the sophisticated tools of mass psychology, learned that the most potent fuel for this engine was sex. The female body, dissected and idealized in print and on television, became the universal signifier for desirability, not just for sexual pleasure, but for the pleasures of ownership, success, and social acceptance. A car was sold with a bikini-clad model draped across its hood. A bottle of champagne was elevated by the presence of a woman in an evening gown, her gaze promising untold sophistication. This pervasive commercial eroticism created a profound cultural dissonance. On one hand, society officially celebrated monogamous marriage and domestic bliss. On the other, it flooded the public sphere with images that commodified the human form and promised fulfillment through the consumption of beauty and sex appeal. The sex worker, in this new context, was no longer an isolated figure of the underworld, but the logical, if extreme, endpoint of a culture that had learned to sell everything, including intimacy. Piece by piece, this commodification dovetailed perfectly with the new geography of the modern city, the urban renewal projects of the mid-century, with their stark towers of steel and glass, their multi-lane highways and their sprawling suburbs created landscapes of anonymity, the intimate. Walkable neighborhoods where everyone knew each other as business were increasingly replaced by environments where one could be a stranger among strangers, the automobile. That mobile private room became a new venue for transaction, a detached and impersonal space for the briefest of encounters. The telephone, and later the early internet, provided yet another layer of remove, digitizing the initial contact and further abstracting the human relationship at the core of the exchange. The transaction became cleaner, more efficient, and more deeply lonely. Yet, even as the structures of modern life seemed to facilitate a more discreet and organized sex industry, the old anxieties persisted, flaring up in new moral panics. The latter half of the century saw the rise of the call girl, a figure of glamour and mystery, often depicted in films and pulp novels as both aspirational and tragic, but it also saw the relentless stigmatization of street-based sex workers, who became the primary targets of police crackdowns and public scorn. The language of public health, so potent during the wars, returned with a vengeance during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 1990s. Sex workers were once again framed as vectors of disease, a dangerous reservoir of infection threatening the general population. This time, however, the discourse was even more heavily medicalized and freighted with fear, leading to further marginalization and violence against a group already pushed to the edges of society. Amidst this cycle of commercialization, criminalization, and pathologization, a new voice began, tentatively, to emerge, the voice of the sex worker themselves. The latter decades of the century saw the birth of the sex workers' rights movement, with organizations like Coyote Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics in the United States, founded by the activist Margot St. James in 1973. This movement sought to fundamentally reframe the debate. They argued against the narratives of sin and sickness, and even against the paternalistic language of rescue. Instead, they spoke of work, rights, and safety. They demanded decriminalization, not as a moral concession, but as a practical necessity to protect their health and safety. to allow them to report violence without fear of arrest, and to access banking and housing without discrimination. They challenged the very term prostitute, preferring sex worker to emphasize the labor involved, the deliberate exchange of a service for money, stripping it of its centuries-old moral baggage. This was a radical departure, a direct challenge to the entire edifice of religious, medical, and legal authority that had sought to define these women for millennia. It was a move from being a subject of discussion to being an agent in it. The 20th century, which had begun by subjecting prostitution to the cold scrutiny of science and the state, ended with the objects of that scrutiny beginning to talk back, to assert their own humanity, and to demand the right to define their own lives and labors. The humming neon lights of the red light district now illuminated not just a marketplace of bodies, but the earliest stages of a political struggle that would carry the oldest profession into the uncertain train of the 21st century, a struggle over who ultimately holds the power to name, to judge and to control. The glow of the cathode ray tube, that soft, bluish light that once defined the evening hours in living rooms across the globe, has been largely supplanted. In its place is the cooler, more intimate glare of the LCD and old screen, a light held in the palm of the hand or stared into from the darkness of a bedroom. A personal sun round which a new universe has rapidly formed. This digital dawn, emerging in the final decades of the 20th century and accelerating into the 21st, did not so much change the world as it created a new one layered on top of it, a world of instantaneo, U.S. connection, boundless information, and profound isolation. And within this nascent digital landscape, the ancient practice of sex work began another of its great metamorphoses, fragmenting into a constellation of forms as diverse and complex as the Internet itself, while simultaneously forcing a global and deeply polarized conversation about the very nature of work, autonomy, and the right to one's own body. The final quarter of the 20th century was marked by a rising tide of identity politics, and from this churning water emerged a new and fiercely divided voice, feminism, the movement, which had already secured significant legal and social victories, now turned its gaze inward, fracturing over the question of the female body and its relationship to power. On one side stood the abolitionist or radical feminist perspective. For thinkers like Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, prostitution was not a choice but the ultimate expression of patriarchal domination, a system that reduced women to objects from male consumption and reinforced their fundamental inequality. In this view, the act was inherently violent, a violation of the self that could never be truly consensual in a society structured by male power. The language of sex work was, to them, a dangerous euphemism that masked this brutal reality. The only moral and political stance was to abolish the industry entirely, rescuing the women trapped within it. Rising in direct opposition was the sex-positive feminist and sex workers' rights movement, building on the foundations laid by activists like Margot St. James of Coyote. This branch of feminism argued for agency and self-determination. They contended that the true oppression was not the sale of sexual services itself, but the stigma, criminalization, and economic precarity that surrounded it. They framed their work as just that worker form of emotional and physical labor that, when chosen, could be a legitimate and even empowering means of financial independence. To deny a woman the right to use her body in this way, they argued, was itself a form of paternalistic control. This fundamental schism between the view of the prostitute as a victim to be saved and a worker to be empowered would come to define the modern debate, creating unlikely political alliances and ensuring that no single policy would ever satisfy all concerned. It was against this backdrop of ideological conflict that the digital revolution began to reshape the practical realities of the trade, the early internet, with its anonymous chat rooms and classified ad websites, provided a discreet and relatively safe space for clients and workers to connect, moving the initial transaction away from the dangerous street corner and into the private, textual realm of the screen. But the true earthquake was the rise of the commercial web, platforms like Craigslist and, later, Backpage created a centralized, searchable marketplace that dramatically increased efficiency and safety for independent workers, allowing them to screen clients, set terms, and operate with a degree of autonomy previously available only to the most elite courtesans. This was followed by the era of review boards and specialized websites, which introduced a form of quality control and accountability for both client and provider that mirrored the systems of eBay and Amazon. The digital footprint, while a risk, also created a layer of verification and community, however fragile. This technological shift had a profound social effect. It began to normalize the client, the anonymous, often shame-filled figure of the past could now, from the safety of his own home, research, discuss, and rationalize his desires within online forums. He was no longer just a John, but a hobbyist, a client, a participant in a subculture with its own rules, etiquette, and jargon. This digitization of desire commodified it in a new way, turning intimate acts into services that could be rated, reviewed, and compared with the dispassionate language of a consumer report. The transaction was stripped of some of its mystery, and in the process, for some, it was stripped of some of its stigma. As the online world evolved, so too did the physical landscapes of commercial sex, though now they were increasingly shaped by starkly different national philosophies. A handful of jurisdictions chose the path of legalization and regulation, treating sex work as a legitimate business in the Netherlands, particularly in Amsterdam's famed De Wallen district. The illuminated windows became a tourist attraction in their own right, a symbol of the country's famed pragmatism. Here, sex work was treated as a taxable enterprise, with workers renting their boots, paying income tax, and operating under the protection of the law. The goal was not moral endorsement, but control, to separate the trade from organized crime, to ensure health and safety standards, and to bring it out of the shadows. Similarly, in Germany, the passage of the Prostitution Act in 2000 aimed to normalize the industry, granting workers the right to legal contracts and access to social security. The brothels that resulted, some sprawling, multi-story complexes like the infamous Pasha in Cologne, were monuments to this utilitarian approach. Their very scale and openness a testament to the belief that regulation could manage what prohibition could not. Elsewhere, the model was one of decriminalization, most famously in New South Wales, Australia, and New Zealand. This was a crucial distinction. Rather than creating a complex framework of state-controlled brothels and licenses, decriminalization simply removed all criminal penalties for consensual adult sex work, treating it like any other service industry. The New Zealand model, in particular, implemented after a landmark report by the Prostitution Law Review Committee, was hailed by activists as the gold standard. It allowed workers to operate independently or in collectives, to refuse clients, and to enjoy the full protection of employment and human rights law. The result, according to subsequent reviews, was a significant improvement in workers' safety and well-being, with better relations with police and a reduced risk of violence. And then there was the Nevada model, a unique American anomaly in a handful of its rural counties. Licensed brothels were permitted to operate, isolated in vast, empty deserts, their presence marked by signs that seemed to rise from the dust itself. These were highly regulated, secure facilities. But their remote location and the strict control exerted by owners often drew criticism from rights activists, who argued that the system created a form of gilded captivity. Legal but heavily restricted, this stood in stark contrast to the rest of the United States, where, with the exception of these few counties, a neo-abolitionist policy held sway. The passing of the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act Foster and the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act Sester in 2018 effectively shuttered the online platforms that had provided a measure of safety for independent workers, driving the trade further underground and, according to numerous studies, increasing the risks of violence and exploitation. It was a clear example of policy driven by the abolitionist perspective, with the unintended consequence of harming the very people it purported to save. In other parts of the world, the reality was far more complex and often grim. In cities like Bangkok or Pattaya in Thailand, the sex industry was a massive, unofficial pillar of the tourist economy, existing in a legal grey zone. The vibrant, chaotic nightlife scenes, with their go-go bars and massage parlors, masked a system often predicated on economic desperation and, at its worst, human trafficking. Here, the line between chosen work and exploitation was often blurry, a murky spectrum where Western fantasies of exoticism collided with the harsh economics of global inequality. This global disparity highlighted the central and resolved tension of the modern era, in a world of porous borders and vast economic imbalances. Could any form of sex work be truly free when the alternative for so many was a life of crushing poverty? The 21st century has thus left the world with no consensus. The debate continues to rage in legislative chambers, on university campuses, and across social media platforms, a heated argument over morality, economics, and human rights. The digital realm, once a haven of relative anonymity, has become a battleground, with workers using social media to organize, destigmatize, and build community, while simultaneously facing the constant threat of deplatforming, harassment, and exposure. The glow of the smartphone screen now illuminates both liberation and new forms of control. We have moved from the medieval stews to the neon-lit windows of Amsterdam, from the Victorian streetwalker to the digitally savvy independent escort. But the core questions remain, echoing down the centuries. Who owns the body? What is the price of intimacy? And in the endless negotiation between desire and morality, between survival and dignity, where does the power truly lie? The conversation is not over. It has simply found a new, global, and endlessly scrolling form. It is a quiet hour, the kind of hour where the noise of the world recedes, and one is left only with the slow turning of thoughts. The 10-part journey we have taken, from the temple complexes of antiquity to the digital glow of the modern screen, now settles into a final, contemplative silence. We have traced the contours of a history that is not a simple linear narrative of progress or decay, but a deep, cyclical current running beneath the grand stories of kings, conquests, and civilizations. It is a history written not in treaties or in the births of heirs, but in the countless, unrecorded transactions in the shadows of palaces, along the edges of marketplaces, and in the rented rooms of every city ever built by human hands. To look upon this long and complex tapestry is to see, reflected back at us, the enduring and often contradictory essence of humanity itself. The oldest profession has never been a mere sideshow to civilization. It is a dark mirror, held up to our societies, revealing with unflinching clarity our deepest struggles with survival, power, desire, and the eternal quest to impose moral order upon the chaotic urges of the flesh. The most fundamental, the most ancient, and the most relentless of these themes is survival. Across the millennia, the economic imperative has been the stark, unyielding constant. For the vast majority of those who have engaged in this trade, it was never a question of libertine philosophy or sexual liberation, but a simple, brutal calculation in the arithmetic of existence. In the dust of ancient Mesopotamia, the widow with no kin. In the crowded insulae of Rome, the slave girl cast out from her household. In the soot-choked air of Victorian London, the seamstress whose eyes failed her from endless work in dim light. In the sprawling, anonymous metropolises of the 21st century, the single mother with no safety net for these figures. The choice was rarely between virtue and vice, but between one form of selling one's body and another. It was the sale of the body's labor in a factory, which could break it slowly through exhaustion and disease, or the sale of its intimacy, which carried the more immediate, violent risks of pregnancy, disease, and social annihilation, but often for a greater and more immediate return. This stark economic reality has been the engine of the profession, a grim testament to the fact that when society fails to provide a foundation of security for its most vulnerable, particularly its women, the body becomes the final, negotiable asset. The history of prostitution is, in large part, a hidden ledger of female economic precarity, a chronicle of the desperate strategies employed to simply remain alive in a world that has often been brutal, the indifferent to their fate. Yet, this raw economic reality has always existed in a tense and paradoxical relationship with society as need for control. From the moment the first Sumerian priest-king recorded the temple's earnings, the state in its various guises as theocracy, monarchy, or republic has sought to manage, tax, and contain this powerful and disruptive force. We have seen this impulse manifest as the licensed brothels of medieval Toulouse, the Messens torrents of Napoleonic Paris, the militarized bordellos of the world wars. The goal was never eradication, but containment. It was the application of a brittle, pragmatic order, the creation of a social sewer, as St. Augustine so vividly described it, to prevent the entire palace of society from being fouled. This institutional control was a grand, societal hypocrisy, a way to benefit from the trade through taxation, through the preservation of social order, through the protection of respectable women while publicly condemning it, the woman within the brothel, or walking the designated street, served as a scapegoat, a living sacrifice who absorbed the moral pollution of the community, allowing everyone else to pretend their hands were clean. Her body became a territory to be mapped, policed, and regulated. A physical manifestation of the boundary between the acceptable and the forbidden, and whatever. Desire that fueled this entire economy. It is the silent, unspoken engine in every transaction. The intangible need that creates a market for the most intimate of tangible services. Human desire, in its rawest form, is a force of nature amorphous, relentless, and unconcerned with social contracts or religious dogma. It has been feared, pathologized, sanctified, and commercialized, but it has never been extinguished. The history of prostitution is also the history of our attempts to grapple with this unruly part of ourselves. The medieval theologian channeled it into the concept of a necessary evil, a grudging acknowledgement of its power. The Renaissance humanist, rediscovering classical ideals, attempted to aestheticize it, to see in the courtesan's form a pathway to divine beauty. The Victorian, terrified of its power, pushed it into the shadows of the city and the recesses of the mind, only to have it erupt in the lurid fantasies of the penny dreadful and the private collection of erotic art. The 20th century psychologists sought to medicalize it, to give it a clinical name and a diagnosis. And the 21st century marketer has learned to commodify it, to harness its power to sell everything from cars to cologne. The client, so often a phantom in this history, is a reminder that this is not a story about women alone, but about a fundamental human dynamic. He represents the eternal, complicated interplay of loneliness and lust, of the hunger for power and the yearning for a moment of uncomplicated acceptance, a transaction stripped of the complex emotional labor of romantic pursuit. Finally, we arrive at the most shifting and malleable of all these themes, morality. The judgment placed upon the sex worker has been the ultimate barometer of a society's values, its fears, and its deepest insecurities. She has been consecrated as a holy vessel in the temples of Inanna, damned as a soul-corrupting sinner from the pulpits of medieval Christianity, pitied as a fallen woman by Victorian reformers, pathologized as a neurotic by Freudian analysts, and celebrated as a free agent by sex-positive feminists. Her identity has never been her own. It has been a projection screen for our collective anxieties about female sexuality, property, purity, and social order. The language used to describe her harlot, whore, courtesan, fille de joie, sex worker reveals not who she is, but who we are, and what we most fear at any given point in history. The great, enduring hypocrisy has been the double standard, the relentless focus on the woman who sells, while the man who buys has so often been viewed with a wink and a nod. His actions seen as an unavoidable, almost natural. Folly, this disparity in judgment lays bare the patriarchal foundations of so many of our civilizations, where the control of female sexuality has been paramount to the maintenance of bloodlines, property rights, and social stability. As we bring this long reflection to a close, the narrative does not end with a neat resolution or a final verdict. It simply settles. Like dust in a quiet room, the arguments will continue. The abolitionist, the regulatory, the decriminalization models will all be debated in parliaments and on street corners with passion and conviction. The digital realm will continue to evolve, creating new forms of connection and new vectors of exploitation. The ancient economic imperatives will persist, as will the complex human desires that give them shape. To understand this history is to understand that there is no single story of prostitution. There are only millions of individual stories, each one a unique nexus of circumstance, choice, coercion, and survival. It is the story of the Sumerian priestess who felt the presence of a goddess in her ritual, and the story of the indentured woman in a Bangkok bar who feels only despair. It is the story of the Renaissance courtesan who wielded power with her intellect and charm, and the story of the crack-addicted woman on a modern street corner who has power over nothing, not even her own body. To judge the institution as a monolith is to miss the profound, deeply human complexity within it. Perhaps, then, the only appropriate tone with which to conclude is not one of judgment, but of a quiet, clear-eyed empathy. The history of the oldest profession holds up a mirror, and in its reflection, we see the entirety of the human condition, our struggle for survival, our hunger for connection, our fear of our own desires, our towering hypocrisies, and our endless, flawed attempts to build a moral world atop the chaotic and beautiful foundation of human nature. It is a history that asks not for our condemnation, but for our understanding, a reminder that behind every transaction, every law, every moral pronouncement, there has always been a human being, simply trying to navigate the impossible currents of their time. This reflection would be incomplete without acknowledging the profound silence that surrounds the deepest wounds within this history. For every celebrated courtesan, there were countless enslaved and indentured women whose stories were erased, their suffering a silent foundation for the economies of empires. The history we can trace through laws and art is the history of the visible. It cannot capture the full, mute horror of the janitor, the Roman doorkeeper who was also a slave prostituted by her master, or the countless victims of wartime sexual violence whose bodies were treated as mere drain of conflict, This vast, silent ocean of suffering is the counterweight to any romanticized narrative. A sobering reminder that the story of selling sex is inextricably linked to the story of power, and the absolute power of one human over another has so often manifested as the absolute right to use the body for a pleasure or profit. The modern conversation about trafficking is but the latest chapter in this ancient, grim reality, forcing us to confront the fact that consent is a fragile concept, easily fractured by the pressures of poverty, coercion, and despair. Yet, even within this darkness, there persists a stubborn, resilient thread of agency. It is the agency of the Greek hetairai who commanded fees for her mind as much as her body, using her earnings to secure a measure of independence in a world that offered her none. It is the agency of the 18th century London prostitute who, as told in the pages of Harris's list of Covent Garden ladies, crafted a persona and marketed her unique attributes, however exaggerated, to carve out a niche in the competitive marketplace. It is the agency of the 21st century online content creator, who leverages technology to control her image, set her boundaries, and monetize her sexuality on her own terms, directly and without intermediaries. This thread is not a simple story of empowerment, for it is always woven through with risk and stigma, but it complicates the narrative of perpetual victimhood. It speaks to the human capacity, even in the most constrained and degraded of circumstances, to seek a sliver of control, to strategize, to negotiate, and to assert a will to survive not just physically, but on one's own negotiated terms. This tension between utter powerlessness and the fierce, flickering flame of agency is the central, heartbreaking drama of the entire history. And so we are left not with answers, but with a deeper, more resonant set of questions. The oldest profession, in the end, holds up a mirror not to our morality, but to our humanity in its most raw and unadorned state. It shows us the brutal calculus of survival, the intoxicating and terrifying nature of desire, the architecture of power and control, and the endless, shifting kaleidoscope of moral judgment. It reveals the stark economic foundations upon which our societies are built and the intricate hypocrisies we construct to hide them. To study this history is to undertake a long, slow walk through the shadowed corridors of the human experience, to listen for the echoes of millions of forgotten lives. It is to understand that the transaction between a buyer and a seller of intimacy is one of the most ancient human rituals, a ritual that lays bare our deepest vulnerabilities, our most profound needs, and our most enduring contradictions. In the final, quiet analysis, the story of prostitution is simply the story of us, all of us, in our relentless, flawed, and endlessly fascinating struggle to be human. And that is the story of the oldest profession. It's easy to call it sin, or scandal, or survival, but the truth is, it's all of those things at once. From the temples of Babylon to the alleyways of London, every era found its own way to hide what it could not erase. What began as ritual became necessity. What was once sacred became secret. And yet, across every border, every law, every faith, it endured, because behind every transaction was something larger: hunger, power, loneliness, and the endless attempt to understand what it means to be human. If you made it this far, tell me, what time is it where you are? Midnight, morning, somewhere in between. I always like knowing when history finds you. And if you enjoy slow, quiet journeys through the uncomfortable corners of our past, make sure to like, subscribe, and come back for the next one. Until then, stay curious, stay calm, and as always, boringly accurate.